Before we dive into the story, I have a quick request. If you find yourself enjoying the narrative, please hit that like button. It really helps me know that you're loving what you're hearing. Also, I'm looking for new locations for future stories, so if there is a specific town or city you'd love to see a story take place in, drop the name in the comments below. Now, let's get started.
Chapter 1. The Opposite of Grace. The cat, a ginger tabby with the audacious swagger of a pint-sized lion, was entirely to blame. Had the feline not chosen that exact moment to dart from behind a dumpster in the Crossroads alley, Grace Donovan would not have yelped. She would not have stumbled over her own feet, a common enough occurrence but disastrous in this context. And she certainly would not have careened sideways into a teetering stack of wooden crates, sending them crashing to the cracked asphalt with a sound like God bowling a strike. The two men who had been murmuring in low, menacing tones to a third man in a suit that cost more than Grace's monthly rent froze. All three heads swiveled in her direction. They looked less like startled businessmen and more like a pack of coyotes who just had their kill interrupted by a clumsy, brightly colored bird. Grace, wearing a vintage floral dress that screamed, "I frequent estate sales," and clutching a tote bag filled with 3 pounds of gourmet dog biscuits, certainly felt like that bird. "Oops," she said, her voice a small, inadequate squeak in the sudden, ringing silence. Her big heart, usually so full of defiant courage, was currently trying to hammer its way out of her ribcage. She straightened up, brushing dust from her dress in a futile attempt to regain some semblance of dignity. "Sorry. Clumsy me. Stray cat. You know how it is." The man in the suit, whose polished shoes were now half-dusted with the mysterious white powder that had spilled from one of the broken crates, did not look like he knew how it was. His eyes, dark and cold, narrowed. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Grace, however, was not one to back down from a twitching jaw. Her initial fear was already being shouldered aside by a familiar, reckless indignation. The way the suited man had been looming over the other two, the tense set of their shoulders, it all pinged her internal radar for bullying. And Grace Donovan did not abide bullies. "You should really stack those more carefully," she advised, pointing a finger at the mess. "That's a real workplace safety hazard." 50 yards away, parked in a dented gray sedan that blended perfectly with the urban grime, Luke Rhodes closed his eyes and whispered a word that would have gotten his mouth washed out with soap as a child. Her. Of all the alleys in all of Kansas City, she had to walk into his. For 3 weeks, Luke's life had revolved around a single grainy photograph pinned to the corkboard in his sterile task force office. It was a picture of a woman with a cascade of unruly auburn hair, caught mid-laugh as she tried to wrangle a leash-tangled golden retriever. The subject was Grace Donovan. And according to every piece of intel his team had painstakingly gathered, she was the unknowing keeper of the key that could bring down Javier Mendoza's entire cartel operation. She just didn't know it. The plan had been simple. Surveillance, a carefully planned approach, a gentle conversation. He was supposed to be the easygoing, charming cop who could coax her into looking through her late uncle's things without scaring her. He was not supposed to watch her trip over a cat and swan dive into the middle of a cartel drug buy. His law enforcement instincts, honed over a decade of seeing the worst of humanity, were screaming. Every nerve ending told him to stay put, to not blow the months-long surveillance operation on a low-level handoff. But then he saw the glint of metal as one of the goons shifted his jacket, revealing the butt of a handgun. And he saw Grace, bless her stupid, reckless, unbreakable spirit, puffing up her chest as if she were about to lecture a man who filleted people for a living about proper stacking protocol. The professional in him groaned. The man in him felt an unwelcome, deeply inconvenient lurch of protectiveness. He put the car in neutral, his hand hovering over the gear shift, his mind racing faster than the downtown streetcar. 48 hours earlier. The photograph on the projector screen was blurry, a candid shot taken from a distance. Javier Mendoza, impeccably dressed, was shaking hands with a dockworker. It looked like nothing. A politician greeting a constituent. A boss greeting an employee. But Luke Rhodes knew better. He pointed a laser at a figure in the background, almost lost in the shadows of a shipping container. A man with a camera. Arthur Donovan, Luke said to the room of grim-faced federal agents. Freelance photographer. Died of a massive coronary a year ago. He specialized in industrial and architectural photography. Spent half his life in the warehouses and rail yards where Mendoza's crew moves their product. His boss, Special Agent Kincaid, steepled his fingers. You think he caught something by accident? I think he caught everything by accident, Luke countered, clicking to the next slide. It was a logbook, meticulously kept. Dates, times, locations. Donovan was old school. Kept everything. Hard drives, film negatives, contact sheets. His niece, Grace Donovan, inherited his entire archive. It's all sitting in the attic of her Brookside bungalow right now, boxes and boxes of it. So we get a warrant, another agent said, shrugging. A warrant for what? Luke shot back, his easygoing demeanor gone, replaced by the sharp focus of a predator. A fishing expedition? Your Honor, we think there might be a photo of a crime somewhere in this man's life's work. Mendoza would hear about it before the ink was dry. He'd know we're onto his shipping routes, and Grace Donovan would have a target on her back so big you could see it from space. No, we can't go in loud. I approach her, gain her trust. We find what we need, and she never has to know she was in danger. Kincaid had nodded slowly, looking from the logbook to the photo of the laughing woman with the auburn hair. All right, Rhodes, she's your project. Keep it quiet, and keep her safe. Safe was the last thing Grace felt now. The man in the suit, Rico, took a slow, deliberate step toward her. He had the unnerving stillness of a lizard, all cold-blooded calculation. You are making a mess, Rico said, his voice a low, gravelly purr that slid unpleasantly down Grace's spine. Well, you made the first mess by being jerks, she retorted, crossing her arms. Her brain was screaming at her to run, to shut up, to do anything other than antagonize the man who looked like he flossed with barbed wire. But her mouth, as usual, had other plans. It was a problem she'd had her whole life. Her spirit wrote checks. Her 5'7", decidedly unmuscular body couldn't always cash. From his vantage point, in a penthouse overlooking the city, Javier Mendoza sipped a glass of añejo tequila and listened to the voice on his phone. And then this woman, a complete idiot, falls into the crates, Rico was explaining. The product is everywhere. Javier felt a familiar prickle of annoyance. He despised complications. His empire was built on smooth, silent, brutally efficient logistics. Clumsy women and spilled product were anathema to him. Is it contained? Yes, boss. But the woman, she's not leaving. She's arguing with us. A flicker of something other than annoyance sparked in Javier's mind. Stupidity, he could handle. Defiance, however, that was a different matter. Defiance was a loose thread. And Javier always pulled on loose threads until they unraveled. Kill her, he said, his voice calm, as if ordering lunch. There was a brief pause on the other end. Here? In the alley? It's daylight. Then, be discreet, Javier amended, his patience thinning. Put her in the van. Deal with her later. And Rico? Get me a picture of her face. I want to know who is stupid enough to argue with my men. He hung up and stared out at the elegant curve of the Kaufman Center, its stainless steel gleaming in the afternoon sun. He didn't know why, but a strange sense of unease settled over him. A premonition, perhaps, that this was more than just a clumsy woman. Back in the alley, Rico nodded to one of his men. The message was clear. The man's hand went inside his jacket. Grace saw the movement. For the first time, the full, icy reality of the situation crashed through her bravado. These were not common bullies. This was real danger. Her witty retort died on her lips, replaced by the metallic taste of fear. Just as the goon's hand emerged with the gun, a car door slammed nearby. Grace! Honey, there you are, a voice called out, warm and exasperated. Grace whipped her head around. A man was striding toward them, his expression a perfect blend of loving frustration and apology. He was tall, with an easy way of moving that spoke of confidence. He had kind eyes, but there was a hardness beneath them, a watchfulness that seemed at odds with his relaxed smile. He was, Grace's brain noted with inappropriate timing, incredibly handsome. Luke reached them in a few long strides, ignoring the armed men completely and focusing on her. He gently took her arm. I am so sorry, gentlemen, he said, his voice smooth as Kansas City jazz. She sometimes wanders off if she forgets her medication. The doctor says it's perfectly normal, but it can be a little disorienting for her. He turned that smile on her, and for a split second, Grace saw past the performance. In the depths of his blue eyes, she saw a clear, urgent command. Play along. But Grace was not an actress, and she was furious. Meds? Wandering off? Who did this guy think he was? She opened her mouth to tell him exactly where he could shove his condescending rescue attempt. And then his fingers tightened on her arm, just a fraction. A silent plea. She met his gaze again, and the world seemed to slow down. It was a jolt, a sudden, inexplicable connection that went deeper than the fear and confusion. It was an intense, magnetic pull, a silent acknowledgement of something shared between two complete strangers in the middle of a drug deal gone wrong. Her breath hitched. She saw a flicker of the same surprise in his eyes, a momentary crack in his calm facade. This was not part of his plan. Rico was not buying it. He had seen the way they looked at each other. That was not a caregiver. And his patient. That was something else entirely. Something new. Something dangerous. Get them, Rico ordered, his voice flat. Luke heard the command and knew the play was over. His easygoing smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, hard resolve. In one fluid motion, he shoved Grace behind him, his body shielding hers. His own weapon was in his hand before the first goon could even fully raise his. Federal agent! Luke's voice boomed in the narrow alley, a thunderclap of authority. Drop your weapons! Now! For a heartbeat, no one moved. It was a standoff, two cartel thugs and a calculating lieutenant against one lone agent and a very confused dog biscuit enthusiast. Then, chaos erupted. Luke didn't wait for them to make a decision. He grabbed Grace's wrist, yanking her out of the line of fire. Run! The first gunshot cracked through the air, deafeningly loud, splintering a brick just inches from Grace's head. She screamed, a raw, terrified sound. Luke didn't hesitate. He half-dragged, half threw her toward his sedan, his body a constant shield between her and the gunfire. Get in! He yelled, fumbling with the passenger door. Another shot. This one pinged off the car's fender. Grace scrambled inside, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Luke dove into the driver's side as bullets shattered the back window, spraying tempered glass across the seats. He twisted the key, the engine roaring to life. He slammed the car into drive, tires screeching as he peeled out of the alley and into the street, leaving a cloud of smoke, two furious thugs, and a very large mess of spilled narcotics behind them. He glanced over at Grace. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock and terror, her knuckles white where she gripped the dashboard. Who are you? She finally managed to gasp. Luke's eyes were locked on the rearview mirror, watching for pursuit. The guy who just saved your life. From what? She cried. A bad business meeting? A workplace safety dispute? He risked a look at her then, a look that was a cocktail of sheer disbelief, frustration, and something else, something that looked dangerously like admiration. Something like that, he said grimly, and stomped on the accelerator. Now do me a favor, try not to get us both killed before I can explain. Chapter 2. The Art of the Getaway. The screech of tires was the new soundtrack to Grace Donovan's life. It replaced the gentle hum of the NPR station she usually listened to on her afternoon drives. The world outside the speeding sedan was a frantic blur of brick buildings, flashing traffic lights, and the startled faces of pedestrians. Inside the car, the air was thick with the scent of burnt rubber, gunpowder, and the overwhelming aroma of gourmet dog biscuits, one of which had escaped her tote bag and was now rolling forlornly on the floor mat. Turn left. Here, you'll hit the streetcar tracks if you go straight, Grace yelled, pointing frantically. Her instinct to give directions, honed by years of helping lost tourists in the river market, was apparently stronger than her instinct for self-preservation. Luke Rhodes, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, did not turn left. He shot a glance in the rearview mirror, his jaw tight. I'm not trying to get to the Power and Light District for happy hour, Grace. I'm trying to not get shot. They're not following us. That's what they want us to think, he bit out, expertly weaving the dented sedan through a gap between a city bus and a barbecue delivery truck that was barely wider than the car itself. The truck's horn blared in protest. Grace pressed herself back against the seat, her heart still performing a frantic drum solo against her sternum. Shock was a strange, layered thing. The top layer was icy terror, the kind that made her limbs feel like they were filled with cold water. Beneath that was a bubbling cauldron of pure, unadulterated rage. At the men in the alley. At the ginger cat. At her own clumsiness. And most definitely, at the handsome, infuriatingly calm man currently breaking at least a dozen traffic laws beside her. Federal agent? She demanded, her voice rising. You said you were a federal agent. Are you? Or was that just another line like the wandering off without my medication nonsense? Because let me tell you, buddy, that was deeply offensive and wildly uncreative. Luke risked another look at her. Her face was flushed, her auburn hair, a magnificent storm cloud around her head, and her eyes were shooting sparks of indignation that could have probably set the upholstery on fire. For a man whose carefully constructed, 18-month investigation had just gone up in flames, he felt a shockingly inappropriate urge to smile. She was magnificent. She was a disaster. she was going to be the death of him. "Yes, I'm a federal agent," he confirmed, his voice strained as he took a sharp right onto a one-way street, going the wrong way. "And the medication line saved your life, so you're welcome." "It did not! They pulled a gun anyway. They were pulling the gun to discreetly get you into a van to murder you later. My little bit of street theater forced them to do it out in the open, which gave us a chance to get away. See the difference?" The phrase, "murder you later," hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the car. Grace's tirade died in her throat. The cold layer of terror seeped through the hot rage, chilling her to the bone. This was real. The gun, the splintered brick, the shattered back window. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an attempted abduction. And murder. Her hands started to shake. She wrapped her arms around herself, the vintage floral print of her dress suddenly feeling flimsy and foolish. She thought of her uncle, Arthur. 3 years earlier, the dark room smelled of chemicals and obsession. It was Arthur's sanctuary, a place where the world was reduced to shades of black and white and the slow, magical emergence of an image in a tray of developer. Grace, then 25, was perched on a stool watching him work. His hands, gnarled with arthritis but steady as a surgeon's, gently agitated a print of the downtown skyline at dawn. "You see the world too brightly, Gracie girl," he'd said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He didn't look up from the tray. "You see the good in everyone. You walk into dark alleys because you hear a kitten mewing." "There was a kitten," she defended. "I named him Gus." Arthur had chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "I know, but not every alley has a Gus. Some of them just have rats. Or worse. The world isn't a safe place, and you go through it like you've got a force field around that big heart of yours." He'd finally lifted the print with a pair of tongs, the black and white image of the Kaufman Center gleaming wetly under the red safe light. "I just worry." "You're brave, and that's good. But there's a fine line between brave and reckless, kiddo. Promise me you'll try and learn the difference." She had promised, of course. But looking back, she knew she'd never really understood what he meant until this very moment, in this car, with the ghost of gunfire still ringing in her ears. Javier Mendoza stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city lights beginning to sparkle below like a carpet of scattered diamonds. He held his phone to his ear, his knuckles bloodless. The añejo tequila sat untouched on the marble bar. "Explain it to me again, Rico," he said, his voice deceptively soft. Slowly. "Explain to me how a simple handoff, a transaction a trained monkey could complete, ended in a car chase with a federal agent." On the other end of the line, Rico's voice was strained. "Boss, he came out of nowhere, we had the woman, then this guy shows up, claims she's his patient, then pulls a badge and a gun." Javier closed his eyes. The premonition he'd felt earlier solidified into a cold, hard certainty. This was not a random patrolman stumbling upon a deal. This was targeted. The agent wasn't there for the drugs, he was there for the woman. "Did you get the picture I asked for?" Javier asked. "Yes, boss. I snapped one on my phone before it all went sideways. It's not great quality." "Send it to me," Javier commanded. "And get me the license plate of that sedan. Find out who that agent is, find out who she is, find out where they buy their coffee. I want to know everything. A federal agent does not risk blowing a major operation, and that's what this was, for a random civilian. He was there for her, which means she is important." He hung up, the silence of the penthouse pressing in on him. He walked over to a framed photograph on his bookshelf. It was of him and an older man, both smiling, shaking hands at a charity gala years ago. The man had kind eyes and a camera slung around his neck. Arthur Donovan, a useful man who took excellent photographs of potential investment properties. A man who had been given almost unlimited access to his warehouses and shipping yards. A man who had died, conveniently, of a heart attack. Javier felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He had always pulled on loose threads. And he had a terrible feeling he was about to find one that led all the way back to a dead photographer. Back in the sedan, Luke had finally shaken any potential tail, looping through the labyrinthine streets of the West Bottoms, under rusting viaducts and past old brick warehouses. He pulled into a dimly lit multi-level parking garage and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Luke scrubbed a hand over his face, the exhaustion of the last hour hitting him like a physical blow. His plan, his quiet, simple, elegant plan, was in ashes. Grace was the first to speak, her voice quiet now, stripped of its earlier fire. "Those men, they were going to kill me." Over a stack of knocked-over boxes, Luke turned to face her. In the faint orange glow of the garage lights, he could see the genuine shock and fear in her wide eyes. The reckless, indignant woman was gone, and in her place was someone who had just looked into the abyss. The inconvenient lurch of protectiveness he'd felt in the alley returned with a vengeance. "It wasn't about the boxes, Grace," he said, his voice gentle. "The boxes were filled with cocaine." Her eyes widened further. "Cocaine? I thought it was, I don't know, powdered sugar for a bakery. Who stacks powdered sugar so carelessly?" The absurdity of her statement, the sheer graceness of it, was almost his undoing. He bit the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing. "They're the Mendoza Cartel. They don't run a bakery." "The Mendoza Cartel? Like, on the news?" "The very same." He watched her process this, saw the gears turning behind her eyes as she connected the dots. Her gaze sharpened, losing its frightened softness and regaining its intelligent, analytical edge. "Okay," she said, nodding slowly. "Okay. So you're a federal agent investigating the Mendoza Cartel. You were watching them in that alley. And what's your name anyway?" "Luke. Luke Rhodes. And I, Grace Donovan, stumbled into your surveillance operation." She looked him straight in the eye. "But that's not the whole story, is it, Luke Rhodes? You knew my name. You yelled, 'Grace,' back there like you were my long-lost husband. You weren't just watching them, you were watching me." His carefully constructed cover story, the one about being a historian interested in her uncle's architectural photos, evaporated before it could even be told. He was out of options. He could lie, but he had a feeling she'd see right through it. Her bullshit meter, he was quickly learning, was finely tuned. "Yes," he admitted, the word tasting like defeat. "I was watching you." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. The close confines of the car suddenly felt intimate, charged. He was intensely aware of the stray curl of auburn hair that had fallen across her cheek, of the faint, clean scent of her perfume over the lingering smell of cordite. He could see the pulse beating in the delicate skin of her throat. That jolt he'd felt in the alley, that inexplicable connection returned, stronger this time. A low hum of electricity in the space between them. He saw her swallow, her eyes dropping to his mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting his gaze again. The sexual pull was a tangible thing, a sudden shift in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with the danger they were in, and everything to do with the simple, complicated reality of a man and a woman. "Why?" she whispered. "Why in the world were you watching me?" Luke took a deep breath, preparing to detonate the rest of her life. "It's because of your uncle, Arthur Donovan." Chapter 3. The Photographer's Ghost. The name, spoken in the hushed, orange-lit confines of the parking garage, hung between them like a ghost. Arthur Donovan. Not the cartels, not the drugs, not even the terrifying man in the expensive suit. Her uncle. The man who taught her how to develop film, who smelled of darkroom chemicals and peppermint candies, who called her his Gracie girl. The notion was so preposterous, so utterly disconnected from the reality of the last 30 minutes, that Grace almost laughed. "My uncle?" she repeated, her voice flat. "What does a freelance architectural photographer who has been dead for a year have to do with any of this?" Luke watched her carefully. He had delivered this kind of life-altering news before, and he knew the stages: disbelief, anger, fear, and finally, a terrible, dawning acceptance. Grace, however, seemed determined to add a fifth stage: stubborn, prosecutorial cross-examination. "We don't think he was involved," Luke said, keeping his tone even and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos still thrumming in his veins. "We think he was a witness. An accidental one. Your uncle spent decades documenting the industrial decay and rebirth of this city. That gave him unparalleled access to the very warehouses, rail yards, and shipping docks that Javier Mendoza uses to move his product." Grace's mind reeled, trying to stitch the two images together, her gentle, art-obsessed uncle and the brutal world of a drug lord. It was like trying to sew silk to sandpaper. He took pictures of buildings, Luke, rusting bridges, old brickwork. He found beauty in things other people threw away. He wasn't a crime photographer. "We know," Luke affirmed, "but we think Mendoza's operation was the background noise in his art. A truck being loaded where it shouldn't be. A meeting on a dock that looked innocent. A face in a crowd. Something incriminating, hidden in plain sight on a negative or a hard drive. Something he never even knew he had. Her uncle's archive." The word landed in her stomach like a stone. Boxes upon boxes. Stacks of hard drives. A lifetime of looking, all crammed into the stifling heat of her attic. 1 year earlier, the air in the attic was thick with the smell of old paper, dust, and the faint, lingering scent of her uncle's pipe tobacco. It was the first time Grace had been up there since the funeral, and the sheer volume of his legacy was suffocating. Cardboard boxes, neatly labeled in his spidery handwriting, were stacked to the rafters. West Bottoms 05-08. Crossroads Arts District 99. Casey Rail Yards, Contact Sheets, Volume 12. She'd come up looking for a specific photo, one he'd taken of her as a child, chasing pigeons in the city market. But faced with the silent, overwhelming catalog of a man's entire life, she had sunk onto an old trunk, utterly defeated. It wasn't just photos. There were logbooks, filled with dates and f-stops and shutter speeds, binders of negatives and plastic sleeves, external hard drives with cryptic labels. It was too much. It was the work of a lifetime, and she was just Grace, the clumsy niece who ran a bespoke dog biscuit bakery out of her kitchen. How could she possibly be a worthy custodian of all this? Overwhelmed by a tidal wave of grief and inadequacy, she had closed the attic door, promising herself she would sort through it all one day. A day that, until now, had never come. His archive, Grace whispered, the memory leaving a dusty taste in her mouth. It's all in my attic. Exactly, Luke said. The pieces were clicking into place for her. He could see it in the way her eyes lost their focus for a moment, looking inward. Our intel suggests the key to dismantling Mendoza's entire shipping operation is somewhere in that collection. My job was to approach you, gain your trust, and convince you to let us look through it quietly, without Mendoza ever knowing. Well, you've made a real mess of the bus, quietly, part. She shot back, the familiar spark of defiance returning. A ghost of a smile touched Luke's lips. Yeah, the cat didn't help. The mention of the cat, the small, absurd catalyst for this whole disaster, almost broke the tension. Almost. The reality of their situation came crashing back in. So you were going to lie to me, she stated, her voice hardening. You were gonna what, pretend to be a historian? An art student? Seduce me to get into my attic? The last question hung in the air, suddenly charged with a different kind of tension. Luke's easygoing facade faltered. He looked away for a second, his gaze sweeping the empty concrete levels of the garage, as if looking for an escape route from the conversation. The thought had, of course, crossed his mind, not in a cynical, operational way, but in a human one. From the moment he'd first seen her grainy surveillance photo, the laughing woman with the unruly hair, he'd felt a pull. Seeing her in person, seeing her brave, foolish, magnificent defiance in that alley, had only intensified it. The plan was to be honest, eventually, he said, his voice a lower rumble than before. He met her eyes again, and the space in the car shrank until it felt like it only contained the two of them. The seduction part was not in the official briefing. His honesty and the flicker of something hot and real in his eyes disarmed her more than any lie could have. Her breath caught. The romantic sexual pull, a concept she usually relegated to the cheesy novels her best friend devoured, was suddenly a very real, very present force field humming between them. It was ridiculous. It was inappropriate. It was undeniably there. She was a woman who baked dog treats for a living. He was a federal agent who'd just saved her from a cartel hit squad. Her life didn't have moments like this. A phone buzzed, shattering the spell. Luke pulled his from his pocket, his expression immediately hardening as he looked at the screen. It's my boss, he muttered, answering it. Kincaid. Yes, sir, I'm with her. No, she's not. Sir, the situation was compromised. I made a judgment call. Yes, I understand the operation is blown. But the asset is secure. Asset. The word was like a splash of cold water. That's what she was to him. To them. Not Grace. An asset. A means to an end. A box to be opened to find a prize. The fragile, magnetic connection between them shattered, replaced by a familiar, bracing indignation. While Luke was getting verbally flayed by his superior, Javier Mendoza was staring at a pixelated image on his tablet. The face of the woman from the alley. An unremarkable face. Pretty in a wholesome, girl-next-door way. But there was something in the defiant set of her jaw that snagged his attention. The agent's name is Luke Rhodes, FBI Task Force, Rico's voice reported over the phone. The car is registered to the Bureau. He's been on our perimeter for months. The vehicle he was watching before the incident is registered to a Grace Donovan. Donovan. Javier's blood ran cold. He zoomed in on the photo, then pulled up another file on his computer. A collection of photos from the last gala Arthur Donovan had attended on his dime. He scanned the images until he found one. Arthur, smiling his gentle, absent-minded smile, his arm around a young woman with a cascade of unruly auburn hair. A younger version of the woman in the alley. Gracie girl, Javier whispered, the memory of Arthur's fond voice echoing in his mind. The loose thread he'd felt earlier was now a thick, fraying rope, and he was holding the end of it. Arthur Donovan had a niece. The niece who inherited everything. "Find her," Javier commanded, his voice deadly calm. "Find the girl. Rhodes will take her somewhere he thinks is safe. A federal safe house. We have sources. Find out which one. I don't care about the drugs anymore, Rico. I want the girl. And I want whatever her uncle left behind." He ended the call and stared out at the city. Arthur Donovan, the harmless old photographer, was about to cause him more trouble from the grave than any rival had in a decade. A deep, cold fury settled in his chest. He had trusted Arthur. He had let him into his world. It was a mistake he would rectify by erasing the last living piece of the old man's legacy. Back in the parking garage, Luke hung up, the muscle in his jaw twitching. "We have to move. Now." "Where are we going?" Grace asked, her arms crossed, her tone chilly. "The asset. A safe house. A secure apartment downtown. You can't go back to your home. It's the first place they'll look." He started the car, the engine's roar echoing in the concrete tomb. "And what about my life?" she demanded. "My house? My dog? I have a golden retriever, a very anxious one named Barnaby, who is probably destroying my antique sofa as we speak. I have biscuit orders to fill." Luke pulled out of the parking space, his movements sharp and efficient. "Barnaby is going to have to hold it for a little while, Grace, and I think your clients will understand a delay, considering the alternative was you being folded into the trunk of a van." His bluntness silenced her. He was right. Of course he was right. But it didn't stop the wave of helpless frustration that washed over her. She was a passenger in her own life, being driven away from everything she knew by a handsome stranger who called her an asset. He seemed to sense her turmoil. As he navigated the streets, heading toward the river, his voice softened. "Look, I know this is a lot. My only job right now is to keep you alive. Once you're secure, we'll make arrangements for your dog. We'll figure out the rest." "Okay," she nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She watched the familiar landmarks of her city go by, Union Station, the Western Auto sign, feeling like a tourist in a foreign country. This wasn't her Kansas City anymore. It was a place with shootouts and alleys and men who murdered you later. He pulled into the underground garage of a sleek, anonymous-looking downtown high-rise. He killed the engine, and for a moment they sat in silence again. "Grace," he said, turning to her. His blue eyes were serious, the hardness from the alley gone, replaced by a weary sincerity. "I am sorry for all of this. My plan was to keep you out of it, to keep you safe. I failed." His apology, so direct and unadorned, chipped away at her anger. She saw the weight of his failure on his shoulders, the genuine regret in his eyes. He wasn't just a fed. He was a man who had made a promise to his boss to keep her safe, and now she was anything but. "You didn't fail," she said, the words surprising her. "You saved my life." He held her gaze, and that current, that inexplicable hum returned, stronger than ever. It was a silent acknowledgement of what they had just survived together, a bond forged in terror and screeching tires. "My uncle," Grace said, her voice finding a new strength. "If there is something in his work that can stop those men, I want to find it." Luke's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise and admiration in his eyes. He had expected to have to convince her, to cajole her, to treat her like a fragile victim. He was beginning to understand that Grace Donovan was the opposite of fragile. "It's a needle in a haystack, Grace. Decades of work." "It's my haystack," she replied, a small, fierce smile touching her lips for the first time. "And he taught me how to sort." It was a declaration, a shift in power. She was no longer just the asset. She was a partner. Luke felt that inconvenient lurch of protectiveness morph into something more potent, more complicated. He was in so much trouble. "Okay," he said, his voice husky. "Okay. Let's go upstairs. Then we make a plan to get your haystack back." He got out of the car, but as Grace reached for her door handle, she paused, looking at the single gourmet dog biscuit still on the floor mat. It was a small, absurd reminder of the life she'd had just an hour ago, a life that was now gone forever. She picked it up and slipped it into her pocket, a talisman from another world, before following the man who had both ruined her life and saved it. Chapter 4. Biscuits and Ballistics. The FBI safe house was the opposite of Grace. It was a space devoid of personality, a high-rise apartment furnished in 50 shades of beige by a committee that believed comfort was a security risk. The sofa was stiff, the art on the walls was abstract and forgettable, and the air smelled of industrial cleaner and nothingness. Through the panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows, the Kansas City skyline glittered, a breathtaking vista of light and promise. But from in here, it looked like a postcard from a place she could no longer visit. It was a gilded cage, and the door had just clicked shut behind them. Grace dropped her tote bag, still laden with its now mocking cargo of dog biscuits, onto the cold marble of the entryway. Well, this is sterile. It's clean, Luke corrected, his eyes already sweeping the room, checking locks, peering through the blinds. He moved with a restless energy, a predator confined. No one knows about this location except my direct superior. So, what now? Grace asked, wrapping her arms around herself. We order a pizza and wait for the cartel to forget I exist? Luke stopped his pacing and turned to her. The weariness was back in his eyes, but so was the resolve. Now we make a plan. We need to get into your house and retrieve your uncle's archive. Every hard drive, every negative, every logbook. The mention of her house, her cozy Brookside bungalow with its peeling porch paint and unruly rose bushes, sent a sharp pang of homesickness through her. And with it, a sudden, gut-wrenching realization that made her blood run cold. Oh no, she whispered, her eyes widening. Oh my heavens. Barnaby. Luke's expression tightened. He'd clearly been hoping this topic wouldn't come up for at least another hour. The dog. Right, look, Grace, we'll make a call. The local police can do a wellness check. Get him to a kennel. A kennel? She yelped, the sound echoing in the silent apartment. Absolutely not. Barnaby is a rescue. He has anxiety. He gets hives when he's stressed. He can't be left with strangers in a cage. It's cruel. Being mauled by cartel enforcers is also cruel, Luke countered, his voice dangerously reasonable. Your house is the first place Mendoza will have his people watch. We can't go back there, it's compromised. Grace stared at him, her big heart, which had been cowering in fear for the past hour, roaring back to life with the protective fury of a mother bear. This man, this handsome, capable, infuriating man, did not understand. Barnaby wasn't just a dog. He was the goofy, oversized, unconditionally loving anchor of her chaotic life. He was the warm weight at the foot of her bed, the enthusiastic, slobbery greeter at her door. He was family. I am not leaving my dog to be traumatized in a kennel while I sit here in this beige prison, she declared, planting her hands on her hips. That is a non-negotiable part of my survival. My emotional support animal is essential for my well-being. Luke scrubbed a hand over his face. He'd faced down armed fugitives with more composure. He could feel a headache forming behind his eyes, a specific, Grace Donovan-induced throb that he suspected would become a frequent companion. You are calling a 70-pound golden retriever an emotional support animal? He is profoundly supportive, she insisted, and I am profounding emotional right now. We have to go get him. No! Yes, the professional in him, the man who followed protocols and calculated risks, knew this was insanity. The asset was volatile, a beautiful, walking, talking, operational security nightmare. But the man in him, the one who'd seen her stand up to a killer over stacking protocol, couldn't help but admire the sheer, magnificent stubbornness of her. She was willing to stare down a drug lord, but the line was drawn at an unhappy dog. It was the most ridiculous, reckless, and deeply endearing thing he had ever encountered. Far across the city, in his own, much more luxurious high-rise cage, Javier Mendoza swirled the añejo tequila in his glass. The ice clinked softly, the only sound in the cavernous room. Rico stood before him, head bowed slightly, a tablet in his hand. Her house is quiet, Rico reported. A single light on in the living room. Probably a timer. My men are in position, watching from all angles. There's been no sign of her or Rhodes. Javier took a slow sip. He wasn't angry. Anger was a hot, messy emotion. What he felt was a cold, precise fury, the kind that focused the mind. Arthur Donovan had been his friend. Or, as close to a friend as Javier allowed. He'd enjoyed the old man's company, his quiet observations, his artist's view of the world. He'd given him access, trusted him in his domain. The thought that the old man had been documenting his downfall all along was a betrayal that cut deeper than any business rivalry. It was personal. The niece, Javier said, his voice a low murmur. She was at the funeral, I remember her now. Crying over the old man's casket. All that fire I saw in her face in that photograph today, she gets that from him. He had a quiet fire. He looked at Rico, his dark eyes sharp as obsidian shards. This agent, Rhodes. He's not a fool. He knows the house is being watched. He wouldn't risk taking her back there. But she will want to go back. For sentimental things. A pet, perhaps. People are predictable in their attachments. He gestured to the tablet. I want to know where Rhodes takes his coffee, Rico. I want to know where he gets his hair cut. I want to know the name of his third-grade teacher. And I want you to start checking every high-security federal facility, every anonymous corporate rental in the downtown area. They are in this city, hiding in plain sight. Find them. Find my friend's ghost. And find the girl who can speak to it. Back in the safe house, the argument over Barnaby had reached a tense stalemate. Luke was leaning against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, a mask of grim patience on his face. Grace was pacing the length of the living room, her earlier fear completely replaced by righteous indignation. You're thinking about this like a mission, she said, pointing an accusatory finger at him, but this is my life. You don't get to just pick and choose which parts of it are convenient enough to save. My job is to save the part of you that breathes, he shot back. The rest is a luxury we can't afford right now. Tell me about the archive. That's what matters. How did he organize it? What are we even looking for? The question stopped her pacing. She closed her eyes, the scent of the sterile apartment fading away, replaced by the familiar, comforting smell of developer and dust. She was back in the dark room with her uncle, 3 years earlier. It's not just a filing system, Gracie girl, Arthur had explained, his voice a low rumble under the red safe light. He held up a plastic sleeve of negatives. The label on top was a string of seemingly random numbers and letters. WBS.07.T, 14.R3.F8. It looks like a secret code, she'd said, peering at it. He'd chuckled. It is, of a sort. It's a conversation. WBS, West Bottoms, 07, the year. T14, that's the 14th time I shot in that location. But the rest. He'd tapped the last 2 codes. That's the secret. R3 is the feeling. The mood. R for reflective. 3 is the intensity. And F8? That's the focus. What my eye was really drawn to. Not the whole bridge, but the way a shadow fell across the 8th girder. It's a map of my eye, but also of my heart. Anyone else would just see a bunch of numbers. But you know the language. He had looked at her then, a strange, sad seriousness in his kind eyes. It's important to have a language no one else understands, kiddo. Keeps the important things safe. Grace's eyes snapped open. She was back in the beige apartment, staring at Luke. It wasn't just a filing system, it was a cipher. A map of her uncle's heart. And she was the only one with the key. He had a system, she said, her voice quiet but filled with a new certainty. A code. It was based on location, date, but also on his emotional response to the image. What he felt was the true subject of the photo. Luke frowned, not understanding. So you can't just send a team of agents in to grab boxes labeled KC Rail Yards, she explained. A thrill of discovery, of purpose, running through her. They wouldn't know what to look for. The incriminating shot won't be in a folder labeled Cartel Drug Deal. It'll be in a folder labeled something like KCR.15.S2.L7, Kansas City Rail Yards, 2015, S for somber, intensity 2, L for light, focus 7. He wasn't taking a picture of a crime. He was taking a picture of the lonely quality of the late afternoon light hitting a boxcar. The men making a deal in the background were just incidental. We're not looking for a needle in a haystack. We're looking for a piece of hay that feels wrong. And I'm the only one who can feel it. The full weight of her words settled over Luke. She was right. His plan to send a tactical team to retrieve the archive was useless. They'd bring back a mountain of data he had no way to navigate. Mendoza could be long gone by the time they sifted through it all. She wasn't just the asset anymore. She wasn't just a partner. She was the key. The only key. He felt a slow, sinking dread in the pit of his stomach. His job was to keep her safe, to lock her in this tower and protect her from the dragon. But the key to slaying the dragon was locked in the tower with her. She saw the realization dawn on his face, the conflict warring in his eyes. And in that moment, she knew she had him. She walked toward him, stopping just a few feet away. The air between them crackled with the energy of their argument, the gravity of their situation, and that persistent, undeniable hum of attraction. You need me, Luke, she said, her voice soft but firm. You can't do this without me. And I can't do it without Barnaby. He stared at her, at the impossible, infuriating, incredible woman standing before him. Her floral dress was rumpled, her face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes blazed with a spirit that could probably power the entire downtown electrical grid. He thought of his boss, Kincaid. He thought of his operational protocols. He thought of the file on his desk, 3 inches thick, detailing all the ways Javier Mendoza made people disappear. And then he looked at Grace, who was willing to risk it all for a dog with hives, and knew that protocol had just left the building. Fine, he breathed, the word tasting of surrender and sheer insanity. He ran a hand through his hair, the picture of a man making the worst and only decision he could. Fine, we'll go get your dog. And your haystack. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Grace's face. It was the first genuine smile he'd seen from her, and it hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was brighter than the entire city skyline behind her. But we do it my way, he added, his voice a low growl. Every step. No arguments. No sudden urges to lecture cartel lookouts on loitering. My way. Understood? Understood, she said, though the mischievous glint in her eyes suggested her definition of the word might be more flexible than his. She held out her hand as if to seal a business deal. He looked at her small, determined hand, then back to her face. He didn't take it. Instead, he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that was for her alone, a current of heat in the cold room. And Grace? He said, his blue eyes locking with hers. If you get us both killed, I am going to be very, very annoyed. Chapter 5. A Study in Burglary and Biscuits. The plan, sketched out on a complimentary hotel notepad in the beige anonymity of the safe house, was a masterpiece of tactical precision and sheer, unadulterated lunacy. Luke, all sharp angles and focused intensity, drew street grids and sightlines. He marked potential lookout points, calculated approach vectors, and outlined extraction routes. It looked like a plan to invade a small, heavily fortified nation. Grace, perched on the edge of the stiff sofa, kept adding notes of a distinctly different nature. Okay, so we go in through the back fence, she said, pointing a finger at his meticulous drawing. But the third slat from the right is loose, so you have to jiggle it. Don't pull, jiggle. And we have to be quiet past Mrs. Henderson's yard because her Pomeranian, Chairman Meow, has the hearing of a bat and the disposition of a disgruntled dictator. Luke paused, pen hovering over the paper. Chairman Meow? She has a theme, Grace explained, matter-of-factly. Her last one was named Dogja. It's a whole thing. Anyway, once we're at the back door, the key sticks, so you have to pull it out a millimeter before the final turn. We're not using a key, Luke said, his voice tight with the strain of maintaining professional composure. We're not walking up to the front door and announcing ourselves. We're going in dark, silent, and fast. And what about Barnaby's sensitive stomach kibble? She demanded, her focus absolute. It's in the pantry, second shelf. In the airtight container marked, good boy food. We can't forget that. A sudden change in diet would be catastrophic for his system right now, what with the gunfire and the general cartel-related stress. Luke closed his eyes. He was a federal agent, trained to handle high-pressure situations, to anticipate the moves of hardened criminals, to dismantle complex criminal enterprises. Nowhere in his training at Quantico had there been a module on the gastrointestinal fortitude of an anxious golden retriever. He was beginning to suspect Grace Donovan was a chaos agent, sent by a rival agency to slowly drive him insane. Grace, he said, his voice a low, controlled growl. We will secure the kibble. But our primary objectives are 1. Retrieve the archive. 2. Retrieve the dog. 3. Get out without being killed or arrested for breaking and entering our own safe house's primary asset. In that order. I think the dog should be objective 1, she muttered, crossing her arms. A happy dog makes for a more efficient archive sorting partner. It's just science. The man in Luke, the one not bound by federal regulations, was deeply, profoundly charmed. The agent in him was already composing a letter of resignation in his head. Javier Mendoza had no need for notepads. The map of Grace Donovan's life was being constructed in the cold, digital space of his encrypted network. A new icon blinked on the screen of the tablet Rico held. It was a live feed from a pole-mounted camera, showing the quiet, tree-lined street where the Brookside bungalow sat. Another feed showed the back alley. A third, a grainy infrared view from a neighboring roof, covered the yard. Still nothing, boss, Rico said. It's been hours. Maybe they're not coming. Maybe Rhodes took her out of the city. Javier looked away from the screens, his gaze settling on the framed photograph of him and Arthur Donovan. He remembered the day it was taken. A fundraiser for the arts. Arthur had been talking, not about photography, but about the nature of a home. A house is just a box, the old photographer had mused, swirling a glass of wine. It's the ghosts that make it a home. The memories, the routines, the things you leave behind that say, I was here. People will always come back for their ghosts, Javier. It's the most predictable thing about them. He's wrong, Javier said quietly, his voice a cold whisper in the silent room. Rhodes is a professional. He won't risk it. But she will. She will convince him. She will need her ghosts. He turned his gaze back to the live feeds, his patience as vast and cold as a winter lake. And so we wait for her to come home. 2 hours later, Grace was crouched behind a ridiculously oversized hydrangea bush in a yard that smelled faintly of mulch and suburban ennui. She was wearing black yoga pants she'd had to buy at an all-night superstore, a dark gray hoodie, and a new, profound respect for cat burglars. Her heart was a frantic hummingbird in her chest. Luke was beside her, a solid, reassuring presence in the darkness. He was dressed in black from head to toe, and he moved with a fluid silence that was both terrifying and deeply impressive. He held a small pair of binoculars to his eyes, scanning her house, which was just 50 yards away across 2 backyards. The single light she always left on in the living room cast a warm, lonely glow. It looked so normal, so peaceful. It felt a world away. 1 car, down the block, Luke whispered, his voice a low rumble next to her ear. The warmth of his breath on her skin sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the night air. Dark sedan. 2 occupants. They're good. They're parked far enough away not to be obvious, but with a clear view of the front. What about the back? Grace breathed, her eyes fixed on her own back door. Can't see anyone, but that doesn't mean they're not there. He lowered the binoculars and looked at her, his face a collection of shadows and planes in the moonlight. This is the point of no return. You still want to do this? She thought of Barnaby, alone and scared. She thought of the boxes in her attic, a silent testament to a life spent looking. She thought of the cold, dead eyes of the man in the suit. She gave a single, sharp nod. He taught me how to pick the back door lock. The statement was so unexpected it took Luke a second to process. He what? Uncle Arthur, she whispered, a faint smile touching her lips. The memory bloomed, clear and sharp in the tense darkness. 7 years earlier. The trick, Arthur had said, kneeling on the back porch steps, is not to force it. A lock is a conversation, Gracie girl, not an argument. He held a small tension wrench and a pick, tools of his long-forgotten, misspent youth. He'd just locked himself out for the 3rd time that month. Shouldn't we just call a locksmith, she'd asked, holding a bag of melting groceries, and pay $75 for a man to have a 5-minute conversation with my door? Nonsense. He'd let her try, guiding her small hands, teaching her to feel the subtle click of the pin setting. You have to listen. Feel for the give. Be gentle, but firm. It's a lot like photography. Or people, for that matter. When the lock had finally turned with a satisfying snick, her sense of triumph had been immense. There, he'd said, smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners. A useful skill. Never know when you'll need to get into a place you're not supposed to be. Even if that place is your own home, she thought now. The memory, a strange, sad comfort. I can get us in, she told Luke, her voice filled with a certainty that surprised them both. Quietly. Luke stared at her for a long moment, the conflict clear in his eyes. Every instinct he had was screaming that this was a tactical nightmare. Relying on an amateur's lock-picking skills learned from a sentimental photographer was the definition of operational insanity, but looking at the fierce determination in her eyes, he knew there was no other way. He was off the map, and she was holding the compass. Okay, he breathed. Let's go talk to your door. They moved like ghosts, flitting from the cover of a shed to the shadow of a large oak tree. Grace led the way, her knowledge of the terrain absolute. She pointed out the squeaky gate, the patch of gravel, the motion-sensitive floodlight on the corner of the neighbor's garage. Luke followed, his hand never far from the weapon holstered at his side, his senses on high alert, scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. The professional in him was appalled by the risk. The man was captivated by her competence. They reached the back porch. It was shrouded in darkness, the scent of her climbing roses thick in the air. Luke produced a small leather case. Grace took out a tension wrench and a pick, her hands surprisingly steady. She knelt before the lock, just as her uncle had taught her. Luke stood guard, his back to her, his attention focused on the dark yard and the alley beyond. The silence was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the faint metallic scratching from the lock. He was acutely aware of her kneeling just behind him, of her focused breathing. Their lives, his entire operation, rested on her ability to have a quiet conversation with a stubborn piece of brass. Time stretched. Every second felt like a minute. Then, a soft, almost inaudible click. The doorknob turned in her hand. She looked up at Luke's broad back, a surge of adrenaline-fueled triumph shooting through her. He glanced over his shoulder, one eyebrow raised in a question. She gave a thumbs up. He nodded and with infinite slowness pushed the door open. They slipped inside, into the familiar darkness of her kitchen. The air smelled of home, of cinnamon, old books, and faintly, of dog. The silence in here was different. It was the silence of an empty house, a space waiting for its life to return. And then the silence was broken by the frantic, happy scrabbling of claws on hardwood floor, followed by a low, excited whimper from the living room. Barnaby. Grace's heart clenched. Before Luke could stop her, she was moving, a shadow gliding through the dark house she knew by heart. She found the dog cowering by the sofa, his tail thumping a frantic, questioning rhythm against a cushion. She knelt, burying her face in his soft, warm fur, murmuring his name over and over. He whined with joy, a sound that was dangerously loud in the stillness. Luke appeared at her side, a dark silhouette against the window. "Grace, we don't have time," he hissed. Suddenly, a pair of headlights swept across the living room wall, slicing through the darkness, as a car turned into the alley behind the house. Luke grabbed her, pulling her and the dog down behind the sofa. His body was a hard shield against hers, one hand clamped gently over Barnaby's muzzle, the other resting protectively on the back of her head. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of Luke's heart against her back, smell the clean, sharp scent of his skin. The car idled in the alley. A door opened, then closed. They waited, frozen in a tableau of shared terror. Barnaby whined softly under Luke's hand, a low, guttural sound of confusion. The silence stretched, thin and tight. Grace held her breath, listening, every nerve ending alight. Footsteps. Slow, crunching footsteps on the gravel path that ran alongside the house, heading for the back porch, heading for the door they had just left unlocked. Chapter 6. The Ghost in the Pantry. The crunch of gravel was the only sound in the universe. Each footstep was a separate, deliberate explosion of noise that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and directly into Grace's teeth. Luke's body was a wall of muscle and heat behind her, his hands still clamped firmly but gently over Barnaby's muzzle. The dog, a creature of pure, simple emotion, was a vibrating bundle of confusion and suppressed joy, his whole body quivering with the desire to greet the newcomer. Grace held her breath until her lungs burned. She was pressed so tightly against Luke that she could feel the hard line of the weapon holstered at his waist and the impossibly steady rhythm of his heart against her shoulder blade. It was a strange, anchoring beat in the suffocating silence. Her own heart was a wild, terrified bird beating against the cage of her ribs. The back door creaked open. A sliver of moonlight sliced through the kitchen, illuminating a million dancing dust motes. A figure stepped inside, a large silhouette that blocked the light. He didn't turn on a lamp. He stood for a moment, listening, his head cocked with the unnerving stillness of a predator sensing its environment. From his vantage point overlooking the city, Javier Mendoza watched the infrared feed on his tablet. He saw the heat signature of one man, Rico, enter the back of the house. The rest of the property was cold, still. "Anything?" Javier asked into his phone. The back door was unlocked. Rico's voice came back, a low whisper. "Could be nothing. An oversight. But it feels wrong. I'm doing a quick sweep of the ground floor." "Be thorough," Javier commanded. The old man was clever. His niece might be as well. Look for anything out of place. A dish in the sink that's still wet. A lingering scent. Anything. Javier leaned back, the leather of his chair sighing softly. He trusted Rico's instincts. But more than that, he trusted the predictability of people. The girl loved her uncle. She loved her home. She would not be able to stay away. The unlocked door was not an oversight. It was a mistake. It was the loose thread, and Rico was there to pull it. Behind the sofa, Grace's world had shrunk to the space of a few cubic feet. There was the warm, doggy smell of Barnaby's fur, the faint, clean scent of Luke's laundry detergent, and the overwhelming metallic taste of fear in her mouth. The man, she was sure it was the cold-eyed man from the alley, Rico, was moving through the kitchen. The soft scuff of his expensive shoes on her linoleum was a desecration. A floorboard groaned near the dining room. He was getting closer. Barnaby let out a tiny choked whine, a sound of pure canine frustration. Luke's hand tightened fractionally, his thumb stroking the soft fur on the dog's nose in a soothing gesture that was both calming and commanding. Grace watched his hand, saw the controlled strength in it, and felt a bizarre sense of security amidst the terror. He was so calm. It was the calm of a man who lived in this space between heartbeats, a place she had only just discovered existed. This wasn't the first time she had hidden in this house, holding her breath. 15 years earlier. The house had smelled of turpentine and her uncle's chili, a concoction he insisted was a secret family recipe passed down through generations of artistically inclined, culinarily challenged Donovans. Grace, 13 and all awkward limbs, was hiding with him in the dark, cavernous pantry. Outside, the booming voice of their landlord, Mr. Gable, was demanding to know the whereabouts of his prize-winning petunias. "He'll never think to look in here," Arthur had whispered, his eyes dancing with mischief in the dim light filtering under the door. A fat, fluffy, golden retriever puppy, Barnaby's distant predecessor, creatively named Barnaby I, was currently asleep in a laundry basket at their feet, blissfully unaware that he was the prime suspect in the Great Petunia Massacre of that year. "We're going to get in so much trouble," Grace had whispered back, her voice a mixture of thrill and anxiety. "Nonsense," Arthur had murmured, reaching out to tap a large tin on the shelf above her head. It was labeled flour, but Grace knew it contained several $100s in cash. "This is Plan F. F is for fine, mister. Gable, here is an exorbitant amount of money to compensate you for your tragically departed flowers." He then tapped a smaller tin labeled sugar. "And this is Plan S. S is for scram, you old coot, before I tell your wife you were the one who broke her porcelain birdbath last spring." Grace had giggled, a sound she quickly stifled with her hands. "The most important thing, Gracie girl," he'd said, his voice turning serious, "is to always have more than one plan. And to know which secrets are worth keeping. Some you hide in plain sight, like a puppy in a pantry, others." He'd paused, looking around the small, dark space as if it held all the mysteries of the world. "Others you hide so well, you almost forget they're there yourself, until the one person who speaks your language comes looking for them." The memory vanished as the floorboards in the living room creaked again. Rico was in the room with them. He was a presence of pure menace, a void of darkness in the familiar shadows of her home. Grace squeezed her eyes shut. She could hear him moving, a slow, methodical sweep. He paused near the entryway. He paused by the fireplace, where a framed photo of her and Arthur sat on the mantel. Luke's body was tense as a drawn bowstring. He had made a catastrophic error. He had let Grace's emotional plea for her dog override every tactical instinct he possessed. He had walked them into the dragon's den to retrieve a chew toy. Now Rico was less than 10 feet away. A single wrong move, a sneeze, a bark, and it would be over. He could take Rico, he was sure of it, but not silently. And the two men in the car outside would be on them before he could get Grace and the dog out the door. His mind raced, cycling through a dozen violent, desperate plans, each one worse than the last. Rico's phone vibrated, a low buzz that was shockingly loud in the quiet room. He answered it, his voice a low, respectful murmur. "Boss, no, nothing yet. It's clean. Too clean, maybe?" "Yes, I'll check upstairs." He was going upstairs. To the attic. To the archive. Grace's eyes flew open and met Luke's in the darkness. She saw the same stark realization in his gaze. This was it. The whole mission would be lost. Rico would find the boxes, and Mendoza would have everything. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. But then Arthur's voice echoed in her head. Always have more than one plan. She looked around the darkened room, her mind racing. What secrets did this room hold? What could she use? Her eyes landed on her tote bag, lying discarded near the armchair where she'd dropped it. The dog biscuits. It was a stupid, insane idea. It was a Grace Donovan idea. As Rico started toward the stairs, Grace moved. It was a tiny, silent motion. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the single gourmet dog biscuit she'd salvaged from the car. It was shaped like a little fire hydrant and smelled of peanut butter and molasses. With a flick of her wrist born of years of tossing toys for Barnaby, she sent it skittering across the hardwood floor of the dining room, just out of sight. The biscuit slid under the dining room table and came to a stop with a soft clack against the leg of a chair. Rico froze on the bottom step, his head snapped toward the sound. Luke tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. What was that? Rico said, his voice low and sharp, speaking into his phone. He moved off the stairs back toward the dining room archway. He was a silhouette against the window, his own gun now in his hand. He peered into the darkness, listening. The house was silent again. A long, drawn-out moment passed. Probably a mouse. Javier's voice crackled faintly from the phone. The old man's house is probably full of them. Finish your sweep and get out. Rico hesitated for another second, then seemed to relax. Yes, boss. He turned and, without checking the upstairs, walked back through the kitchen. The back door opened and closed. A moment later, they heard the car in the alley start up and drive away. They waited. 1 minute. 2. Luke didn't move a muscle, his body still a protective shield. Finally, he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since they'd entered the house. He slowly released Barnaby's muzzle. The dog instantly began licking their faces with frantic, silent gratitude. That, Luke whispered, his voice hoarse, his lips just inches from her ear, was the single most reckless, idiotic, and brilliant thing I have ever seen. He pulled back, and even in the dim light, she could see the mixture of sheer disbelief and profound admiration in his eyes. The professional agent was gone, and in his place was just Luke, a man who had just witnessed a cartel lieutenant be outsmarted by a dog biscuit. The spell was broken by the urgency of their situation. We don't have long, he said, his voice regaining its sharp edge. He'll report the house is empty, but Mendoza won't believe it. They'll be back. We have maybe 10 minutes. Where's the attic? This way, she said, her voice shaking now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. She led the way up the stairs, Barnaby trotting happily at her heels. Luke followed, taking the stairs 2 at a time to pull down the folding ladder to the attic. He went up first, his weapon drawn, and cleared the space before motioning for her. The stifling heat and the smell of old paper and memories enveloped her. It was just as she'd left it. A mountain of cardboard boxes, a forest of a dead man's secrets. Okay, Gracie girl, she whispered to herself. Time to find the right ghost. What are we looking for? Luke asked, his voice low as he stood guard at the top of the ladder. I don't know, she admitted, running her hands over the familiar, spidery handwriting on the boxes. West Bottoms. Crossroads. River Market. It was all geography. But her uncle's system wasn't just about place, it was about feeling. What would a man like Arthur Donovan feel if he accidentally stumbled upon the cold, ugly machinery of a cartel? Not fear, not excitement, sadness. A quiet, somber disillusionment. Her eyes scanned the labels, looking past the location codes for the emotional ones. Her fingers traced the letters. R. Reflective. H. Hopeful. J. Joyful. None of them felt right. Then she saw it. A stack of negative binders and 3 heavy-looking hard drive cases, tucked away behind a box of old camera equipment. The label was simple, stark. KCR.1, 5S, 8D1, Kansas City Rail Yards, 2015. S, for somber, intensity 8, almost the highest it could be. And the final letter, the one that made her blood run cold, D. He'd never used D before in all the years she'd watched him work. It wasn't in his usual key. It had to be something new. Something he created for a feeling he'd never had to categorize before. Danger. Disgust. Death. This, she said, her voice a choked whisper. She grabbed the binders and shoved a hard drive case into Luke's hands. This is it. I know it is. Grab the whole box, he commanded. We're out of time. They scrambled back down the ladder, hearts pounding. Grace grabbed the bag of good boy food from the pantry, scooped a frantic Barnaby into her arms, an awkward 70-pound armful of fur and panic, and they fled out the back door, leaving it hanging open behind them. They melted back into the shadows of the neighborhood just as another dark sedan, moving without its headlights, turned slowly onto the far end of her street. Chapter 7. A Language of Shadows. The ride back to the anonymous downtown high-rise was a study in surreal silence. The city lights smeared past the windows, beautiful and indifferent. In the back seat, Barnaby, having licked both of their faces into a state of damp submission, had finally collapsed into a heap of golden fur, his head resting on the box of hard drives as if guarding the Holy Grail. The air in the car, a strange cocktail of adrenaline, wet dog, and Grace's lingering floral perfume, was thick with unspoken things. Grace stared out at the glowing arch of the Bartle Hall pylons, but she wasn't seeing them. She was replaying the crunch of gravel, the shadow in her kitchen, the the terrifyingly soft clack of the dog biscuit on the floor. Her hands, resting in her lap, were still trembling. She had been brave in the moment, running on instinct and a stubborn refusal to be a victim. Now, in the aftermath, the fear was settling in, a cold, heavy sediment in her bones. Luke drove with a focused economy of motion, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors. But Grace could feel the tension radiating from him. It was in the tight set of his jaw, the rigid line of his shoulders. He had broken a dozen protocols tonight, risked his career, and nearly gotten them both killed, all for a dog and a hunch. She was the chaos that had ripped through the neat grid of his life, and she wasn't sure if he was furious or grateful. "Thank you," she said, her voice small in the quiet car. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the intermittent glow of the streetlights. "For what? Nearly giving you a heart attack?" "For believing me," she clarified. "About the lock. About the biscuit. About all of it." He was silent for a long moment, navigating a turn onto the highway. "My job is to analyze assets and mitigate risk," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. "My training tells me that you are the single greatest risk I have ever encountered in my professional career." He risked another glance at her, and this time she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a reluctant admiration, a weary warmth that went far beyond professional assessment. "My instincts tell me you're the only asset that matters." The words settled between them, charged and dangerous. Asset. The word didn't sting this time. Coming from him now, it sounded less like a designation and more like a confession. The romantic sexual pull she'd felt in flashes, in the alley, in the parking garage, was no longer a fleeting spark. It was a steady, humming current, a low-frequency broadcast that filled the small space of the car, making her hyper-aware of the way his hands gripped the wheel, the breadth of his shoulders under his dark hoodie, the quiet sound of his breathing. She had to acknowledge it now, if only to herself. In the middle of the most terrifying ordeal of her life, she was profoundly, undeniably drawn to the man who had plunged her into it. He must have felt it too, because the air grew thick, and he cleared his throat, his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. "We get inside, we lock the door, and we don't leave until we know what's in that box." Javier Mendoza stood before his window, the city a glittering tapestry at his feet. He was not looking at the view. He was looking inward, at the architecture of betrayal. The phone call from Rico had been concise. The house was empty. The back door was unlocked. A dog biscuit was found under the dining room table. A dog biscuit. The detail was so absurd, so domestic, that it screamed the truth louder than any alarm. It was a sign of a hasty, panicked exit. It was the ghost of Grace Donovan. They had been there. They were there, Javier said, his voice dangerously calm. Rico, standing a respectful distance away, gave a slight nod. "It appears so, boss. She got something from the house, something she was willing to risk her life for," Javier continued, his mind working with cold, crystalline clarity. "She has it now. The agent, Rhodes, will think they are safe. He will take her back to his burrow, his little FBI-approved hole in the wall, and they will start digging through my past." He turned from the window, his eyes fixing Rico with an intensity that made the hardened enforcer flinch. "I have been patient. I have been methodical. That time is over. I want every resource we have focused on one task, finding that safe house. We have sources inside every level of this city's government. Police dispatch, federal administrative clerks, utility companies. Someone knows where the FBI keeps its secrets. I want that location, Rico. I want it before the sun comes up. Because when it does, I am going to pay a visit to Mr. Rhodes and my old friend's niece. And I am going to collect what is mine." He thought of Arthur then, a memory sharp as broken glass. 10 years earlier, they were on the roof of a warehouse in the West Bottoms at sunset. Javier, then solidifying his control over the city's underworld, was pointing out the shipping routes, the rail lines, the arteries of his growing empire. Arthur stood beside him, not with a camera but with a sketchbook, his charcoal-smudged fingers capturing the play of light on the rusting steel of a bridge. "You see logistics," Arthur had said without looking up from his drawing. "Trucks, trains, timetables. I see a city breathing, inhaling goods, exhaling them. It has a rhythm, a language. And you can read it?" Javier had asked, amused. Arthur had finally looked at him, his gaze clear and penetrating. "I can. And so can you. The difference is, you want to control the language, I just want to listen to it." He had smiled then, a sad, knowing smile. "Be careful, Javier. When you control the language, you can make it tell lies. But the rhythm never lies. And right now, your city's rhythm is getting faster, more frantic. It sounds like a heart under duress. Javier had dismissed it then as the ramblings of an artist. Now he understood. Arthur had been listening all along. And he had written it all down. Back in the beige fortress, the box from the attic sat on the large, sterile coffee table like a Pandora's box of a dead man's secrets. Barnaby, having thoroughly investigated every corner of the apartment and deemed it lacking in interesting smells, was now snoring softly on a ridiculously expensive-looking white rug, his sensitive stomach kibble safely stored in the kitchen. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of exhaustion and manic energy. They had the archive. Or, at least, the part of it Grace's intuition had screamed was important. 3 heavy hard drives and a dozen binders filled with sleeves of negatives. Okay, Luke said, pulling his laptop from a bag. He connected a series of cables and an external drive reader. Let's see what your uncle was so somber about. He plugged in the first drive. The computer whirred. An icon appeared on the screen, but when he clicked on it, a password prompt blocked their path. A single field, blinking expectantly. Luke swore under his breath. Encrypted. Of course it is. It'll take our forensics team weeks to crack this, and that's if we're lucky. Grace stared at the blinking cursor. This wasn't an FBI problem. This was an Arthur Donovan problem. He wouldn't have used a random string of numbers. His codes, his systems, they were all personal. They were a conversation. The one person who speaks your language. Let me, she said, gently nudging him aside. She sat before the laptop, her fingers hovering over the keys. She tried the obvious first, her name, his birthday, the name of his first dog. Nothing. She closed her eyes, trying to transport herself back to the dark room, to the smell of chemicals and the sound of his low, rumbling voice. A lock is a conversation. What was the most important secret he ever taught her? What was the language no one else understood? The memory came to her then, not from the pantry, but from a much later conversation, just a few months before he died. 1 year earlier. He was sitting in his worn leather armchair, a heavy photography book open on his lap, though he wasn't reading it. He looked smaller than she remembered, his usual spark dimmed by a weariness that seemed to go deeper than his bones. Everything is digital now, Gracie girl, he'd said, his voice thin and papery. It's all ones and zeros. So easy to copy. So easy to steal. There's no weight to it. No object to hold. You still have your negatives, she'd reminded him gently. I do, he'd agreed. He'd looked at her then, his eyes holding a strange urgency. But the most important ones, the ones that carry the most weight, they need a different kind of lock. Not just a key, but a question. An unanswerable question. The kind you can spend your whole life trying to figure out. He'd reached out and taken her hand, his own feeling cool and fragile. Do you remember what I told you was the most important tool a photographer has? She'd smiled. It was one of his favorite lessons. Not the camera. The eye. And what is the purpose of the eye? Knee he'd pressed. To see what's really there, she'd recited, the familiar catechism of her childhood. No, he'd said, and his grip on her hand had tightened. That was the lesson for the child. The lesson for you, now, is different. He had leaned forward, his gaze intense. The purpose of the eye is to find the opposite of grace. The phrase had struck her as odd, a poet's turn of phrase that didn't quite make sense. The opposite of grace? What's that? Ugliness? Clumsiness? He had shaken his head, a faint, sad smile on his lips. That's the question, isn't it? That's the conversation. You'll know it when you see it. The opposite of grace. The unanswerable question. Her eyes snapped open. She was back in the safe house, the hum of the laptop filling the silence. Luke was watching her, his expression a mixture of concern and hope. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She didn't type an answer. She typed a question. The opposite of grace. No spaces. No capital letters. A single, perfect string of thought. She hit enter. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft chime, the password prompt vanished. A window opened, filled with thousands of thumbnail images. Luke let out a low whistle. How in the world did you know that? He told me, she whispered, her heart aching with a sudden, sharp pang of grief and understanding. He told me everything. Her eyes scanned the thumbnails. They were just as she'd expected. Late afternoon light on boxcars. Rain-slicked asphalt in a rail yard. Shadows stretching long and lonely across empty loading docks. It was a portfolio of industrial melancholy. Okay, Luke said, leaning closer, their shoulders brushing. "Let's start looking for the piece of hay that feels wrong." They opened the first image. It filled the screen, a beautifully composed shot of a graffiti-covered wall, a single puddle reflecting the gray sky. Nothing. They clicked to the next. And the next. For an hour they moved through the files, a slow, methodical search for a ghost. Grace felt a rising tide of disappointment. Had her intuition been wrong? Was this just another one of her uncle's art projects? And then they saw it. It was the 97th photograph. The composition was the same as the others. Artful, lonely, focused on the architecture of the rail yard. But in the background, almost lost in the deep shadows between two shipping containers, were two figures. One was a dock worker. The other, impeccably dressed even from a distance, was Javier Mendoza. That wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the man standing next to Javier Mendoza. The man shaking his hand. He was older, with a kind face and silver hair. He was wearing the uniform of a high-ranking official of the Kansas City Port Authority. Grace felt Luke stiffen beside her. "I don't believe it," Luke breathed, his voice a tight knot of disbelief. He leaned in, zooming in on the face. The image pixelating into a blurry mess, but the identity was still unmistakable. "Who is it?" Grace asked, her heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm. Luke leaned back, scrubbing a hand over his face. He looked at her, his eyes dark with the implications of what they were seeing. This wasn't just about drugs and shipping containers anymore. This was bigger, deeper, more rotten. "That's Robert Kincaid," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Special agent in charge, Robert Kincaid. My boss." Chapter 8. The Devil You Know. The pixelated face of Special Agent in Charge, Robert Kincaid, stared out from the laptop screen, a ghost at a feast of criminals. The air in the beige safe house, once a sanctuary, instantly turned toxic. Every vent, every window, every locked door was no longer a feature of security, but a potential point of entry for a betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. "No," Luke said, the word a raw, scraped sound. It wasn't a denial, it was a plea. He zoomed in and out, toggling the contrast, as if changing the digital parameters could somehow alter the horrifying reality. But the face remained the same. The silver hair, the familiar set of the jaw, the man who had signed his paychecks and sent agents to their deaths in the name of justice, was shaking hands with the devil in the shadows of a rail yard. Grace felt the shift in him immediately. This solid, reassuring presence at her side seemed to hollow out, replaced by the brittle energy of a man whose foundations had been dynamited. All the pieces of the puzzle that had been plaguing Luke, the leaks, the near misses, the operations that went sideways at the last second, slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. Kincaid wasn't just a mole, he was the architect. "Luke," she said softly, placing a hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid as steel. "Luke, we have to go." He didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at the screen, his mind a maelstrom of memories, recontextualizing a decade of his life. 6 months earlier. The briefing room was cold, the air sterile with the hum of servers. Luke stood before a map of Kansas City, dotted with red pins indicating Mendoza's suspected distribution hubs. Kincaid was behind him, a hand on his shoulder, the picture of a mentor guiding his star agent. "Mendoza's slippery, Rhodes," Kincaid had said, his voice a low, confidential rumble that inspired trust. "Every time we get close, he's a step ahead. It's like he knows our playbook." He'd sighed, a theatrical sound of paternal frustration. "That's why this Donovan lead is so crucial. It's our one angle he can't anticipate. I'm putting you in charge of the girl." He'd then led Luke to his office and handed him a single key card. "This is for a downtown apartment. Corporate rental. Completely off the books. If things get loud with Grace Donovan, you take her there. No one, and I mean no one, knows about it but you and me. It's your emergency exit. Your ghost key." He had squeezed Luke's shoulder then, his gaze firm and steady. "Keep her safe, son. She's the whole game." Son. The memory was a shard of ice in his gut. It wasn't a mission briefing. It was a death sentence being signed. Kincaid hadn't given him a safe house. He'd given him a cage. A pre-arranged kill box where his most dangerous loose end could be neatly tied off. "He knows we're here," Luke whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical shock. He shot to his feet, the spell of the photograph broken, replaced by the ice-cold clarity of imminent danger. "He gave me this place. He knows we have the drives. He knows we just opened them." He looked at Grace, his eyes wild with a terror that was not for himself. "He's coming for us." Chaos erupted in the quiet, sterile apartment. The carefully constructed plan to sift through the archive was shredded. Now there was only one plan. Run. "The drives," Luke commanded, his voice all sharp edges and tactical command. He began unplugging the laptop, shoving it and the hard drives into his own nondescript black backpack. "Take anything you can't leave behind. We have 2 minutes. Maybe less." Grace's mind went blank with panic. What couldn't she leave behind? Her whole life was back at the bungalow. The only things she had here were a change of clothes, a tote bag of dog biscuits, and a 70-pound dog who was now awake and staring at them, his head cocked, sensing the frantic shift in the room's energy. "Barnaby!" she cried, grabbing his leash and the bag of sensitive stomach kibble. It was a ridiculous priority in the face of death, but it was an anchor, a piece of her old life she refused to surrender. "I have the kibble!" "Of course you do," Luke muttered, but there was no heat in it. He was already at the door, peering through the peephole. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over his contacts before he stopped, a bitter, frustrated expression on his face. Who could he call? Every agent he knew reported to Kincaid. He was an army of one, with a civilian and a dog as his backup. "We can't take the elevator," he said, his mind racing. "They'll have the lobby and the garage covered, the fire stairs. They'll expect that too, but it's our only chance. 22 floors. Can you do it?" "I can do it," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. She clipped the leash onto Barnaby's collar, her heart thumping in time with the dog's frantic tail wagging. Luke took one last look around the apartment, his gaze lingering on the glittering skyline beyond the window. He had walked in here as a federal agent. He was about to walk out as a fugitive. He met Grace's wide, frightened eyes across the room. The professional distance between them had evaporated. They were just 2 people in a trap, and the only person in the world he could trust was the woman he was supposed to be protecting. The inconvenient pull he'd felt toward her had morphed into a desperate, elemental need to keep her safe, a feeling that was now hopelessly tangled with his own survival. "Stay right behind me," he ordered, his voice low. "No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, you don't stop running. Understand?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. He opened the door a crack, peered into the silent, carpeted hallway, and then they were moving. They slipped out, the door clicking softly shut behind them, and sprinted for the emergency exit at the end of the hall. The stairwell door was heavy, and the air inside was cold and smelled of concrete and paint. The sudden, echoing slam of the door behind them was the sound of their old lives ending. Down they went, a frantic, clumsy descent. Luke took the lead, his weapon now drawn, his footsteps impossibly light. Grace followed, her hand tangled in Barnaby's leash, the dog thinking this was the greatest, most exciting game ever invented. His claws scrabbled on the concrete steps, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. "Barnaby, quiet, boy, quiet," she whispered, half-dragging him. They were a comical, terrified parade, a rogue agent, a dog biscuit baker, and a blissfully ignorant retriever fleeing a ghost in a government suit. From his penthouse, Javier Mendoza listened to Rico's report, his face a mask of cold fury. "My source at the federal building confirms it," Rico said, his voice tight. "An all-points bulletin was just issued for Agent Luke Rhodes. He's wanted for questioning in a national security matter, believed to be armed, dangerous, and accompanied by a female hostage. They've released her name, Grace Donovan." Javier felt a flicker of something that might have been admiration for his enemy. Kincaid was a snake, but he was a clever one. He was using the very system he commanded to hunt his own rogue agent. It was elegant. It was brutal. "He's painted the girl as a victim," Javier mused. "So if his own men find them and a shootout occurs, she's just tragic collateral damage. No one will question it." He turned to Rico. "He is trying to erase them, which means they have what I want. Kincaid has overplayed his hand. He's made them famous. Every cop in the city will be looking for them now. Find their car. Find where they're running. Find them before he does." 22 flights of stairs felt like 100. By the time they reached the bottom level, a sub-basement that housed the building's humming machinery, Grace's lungs were on fire and her legs were trembling. The air was hot and smelled of ozone and hot metal. Luke scouted ahead, peering around a corner before motioning them forward. They were in a concrete corridor that led toward the loading docks. Freedom was just 100 feet away. Then they heard it. The rumble of the service elevator, descending. "Move!" Luke hissed. They ran, a clumsy, 3-headed beast of panic. They burst through a set of double doors and into the cool night air of the loading bay. The street was just beyond. And parked directly in their path, its engine running softly, was a black SUV with tinted windows. For a heart-stopping second, they froze. Two men in dark suits got out. FBI. Or something that looked like it. Luke didn't hesitate. He shoved Grace to the right, toward the ramp leading down into the deeper recesses of the underground garage. "This way! Run!" The men shouted something, but the words were lost as Luke fired 2 shots over their heads, the sound cracking like thunder in the concrete canyon of the loading bay. The bullets sparked off the wall, a warning they couldn't ignore. It bought them a few precious seconds. They scrambled down the ramp, tires screeching as a car peeled out from a parking spot ahead of them, blocking their path. It was Luke's dented gray sedan. He must have parked it down here as a contingency. He threw his backpack onto the hood, fumbled for the keys, his hands slick with sweat. "Get in," he yelled, yanking the passenger door open for her. Grace bundled Barnaby into the back seat and dove in, her bag of kibble clutched to her chest like a shield. Luke slid into the driver's side as the 2 agents appeared at the top of the ramp, weapons raised. Luke slammed the car into reverse, tires screaming as he spun the wheel, executing a perfect J-turn that swung the back of the car around. He stomped on the accelerator, and they shot up the exit ramp on the opposite side of the garage, bursting onto the street and peeling out into the late-night traffic of downtown Kansas City. In the rearview mirror, Grace could see the black SUV pulling out of the loading bay, its lights flashing as it joined the chase. "They're right behind us," she cried, twisting in her seat. "I see them," Luke said grimly, weaving through traffic with a skill that was both terrifying and breathtaking. He was no longer the easygoing agent. He was a different man entirely, focused, dangerous, and completely in his element. They were fugitives, hunted by the law and the lawless. They had no backup, no sanctuary, and no destination. The entire city was a trap. Luke took a hard left, then a right, his mind a frantic map of the city, trying to find a street, an alley, any path that would give them a lead. Grace looked at his profile, illuminated by the dashboard lights, the hard set of his jaw, the intense focus in his eyes. He was all she had. In the space of a single day, her life had been stripped down to this one car, this one man, and the ghost of her uncle. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but woven through it now was a strange, fierce thread of resolve. She was not a hostage. She was not collateral damage. She was a Donovan. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice surprisingly calm. Luke shot a look in the rearview mirror. The SUV was gaining. "I have no idea," he admitted, his voice raw with the truth. "Everywhere I can think of, he can think of too." Grace looked out the window at the blur of the city. Her city. But she saw it now through her uncle's eyes. A place of secrets, of hidden corners, of stories hiding in plain sight. A language of shadows. And she knew a place he would never have told the FBI about. A place he had loved. A place of beautiful decay. A place no one would ever think to look for them. "I do," she said. Luke glanced at her, surprised by the sudden certainty in her voice. "Take the Broadway Bridge," she instructed, her voice firm. "Head for the airport, but get off at the old Stockyards exit. I know a place." He looked from her determined face to the flashing lights in his mirror, then back again. He was out of options. She was the only plan he had left. Without a word, he wrenched the wheel, the sedan groaning in protest as he cut across 2 lanes of traffic, and accelerated toward the river, toward a future as uncertain and dark as the water flowing beneath the bridge. Chapter 9. The Stockyard Serenade. The Broadway Bridge was a ribbon of light flung across the dark, churning Missouri River. Below them, the city's industrial heartland slept fitfully, a sprawling landscape of rusting metal, silent smokestacks, and forgotten histories. Luke drove like a man possessed, his easygoing demeanor stripped away to reveal the raw, coiled spring tension of a cornered animal. The flashing lights of Kincaid's hunters had fallen back, lost in a series of improbable turns and reckless maneuvers through the one-way streets of the garment district that Grace had called out with the authority of a seasoned getaway driver. "Left here," she commanded, pointing toward a dark, unmarked ramp that plunged down into the West Bottoms. "It's the old cattle run. It'll spit us out by the viaducts." Luke wrenched the wheel, the sedan's suspension groaning as they bounced onto the cracked, weed-choked asphalt. The world transformed. The glittering towers of downtown vanished, replaced by the colossal skeletal remains of warehouses and stockyards. Here, beneath the massive, crisscrossing highways, the city's ambient light barely penetrated. They were driving through a cathedral of decay, a place where shadows had weight and history clung to the air, like the faint, ghostly scent of livestock and iron. "This is your plan?" Luke asked, his voice a low growl of disbelief as he navigated the pockmarked road. "Hiding in a haunted house convention?" "My uncle called this place the city's attic," Grace replied, her gaze sweeping over the familiar, hulking shapes. "It's where everything gets forgotten. People, buildings, secrets. No one comes down here unless they're lost or looking for trouble." "We're both," he muttered, but he followed her directions without question. She guided him through a labyrinth of crumbling brick and corrugated steel, past loading docks that hadn't seen a truck in 50 years, and rail spurs that disappeared into thickets of overgrown sumac. Finally, she pointed to a narrow gap between two brick behemoths. "In there. Pull in as far as you can." Luke nosed the car into the alley, which was little more than a fissure in the urban landscape. He killed the engine and the lights. The sudden plunge into absolute darkness and silence was jarring. For the first time in hours, they were not moving. They were not being chased. They were just still. In the back, Barnaby whined softly, his tail thumping a nervous rhythm against the box of hard drives. The sound was a small living thing in the vast, dead silence. Luke turned in his seat, his face a collection of angles and shadows in the gloom. "Okay, Dorothy. We're not in Kansas anymore, even though we technically are. Where to now?" "We get out and walk," she said. "There's a place he kept. A studio. It's not on any map." They gathered their meager supplies. Luke's backpack with its priceless digital cargo, the tote bag of dog biscuits, and the bag of kibble. The moment they stepped out of the car, the scale of the place enveloped them. The warehouses towered over them like red brick cliffs, blocking out the stars. The air was cool and damp and smelled of rain-soaked earth and rust. Grace led them to a heavy, chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. To the right, it was impassable. But to the left, almost hidden by a riot of wild grapevines, was a section that had been neatly and deliberately cut, then hinged back into place with heavy wire. It was a secret door into a forgotten world. "After you," she whispered, pulling the gate open. Inside, they were in a vast, open rail yard. A dozen tracks, ruddy with rust, fanned out into the darkness. A single, derelict boxcar sat on a siding, its open door a perfect square of deeper black. It was here, in this specific place, that Grace's composure finally cracked. 10 years earlier, the boxcar had been their castle. Arthur had laid out an old army blanket, and they were sharing a thermos of hot chocolate that was more marshmallow than cocoa. Grace, then 18, was complaining about a boy who hadn't called her back. "He's not worth the signal, Gracie girl," Arthur had said, his camera resting beside him. He wasn't taking pictures, he was just looking, absorbing the immense quiet beauty of the place at dusk. "But I thought he liked me," she'd mumbled into her cup. "Liking is easy," he'd rumbled. "Trusting is hard. That's the thing you have to look for. Not the one who makes your heart beat faster, but the one who makes it feel safe." He had gestured with his thermos to the vast, empty yard around them. "This place is honest. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. It's strong. It's broken. And it's still standing. People should be more like that." He then pointed to a small, nondescript steel door set into the base of the largest warehouse. "That's my real studio, my dark room. Not the one the clients see. The one where I develop the pictures I take for myself. The ones that tell the truth." He had pulled a key from his pocket, a strange, old-fashioned skeleton key. "Only one person besides me knows where this is." "Who?" she'd asked. He had smiled and dropped the key into her palm, its metal cool against her skin. "Now, it's you." Her hand went to her pocket now, closing around the smooth, cool metal of that same key. The memory was so vivid, so painful, that it stole her breath. A single, hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Luke saw it. He stopped, his tactical alertness softening for a moment. He reached out, not touching her, but just hovering his hand near her shoulder, a silent offer of support. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. She wiped the tear away with the back of her hand, angry at her own weakness. "I'm fine," she said, her voice thick. He's everywhere in this city. Every corner I turn, there he is." "He sounds like a good man," Luke said quietly. "He was," she whispered. "He would have hated this. All of it. The running, the secrets. He believed in telling the truth." "He did tell it," Luke countered, his gaze intense. "He just used a different language. A language of shadows. and he taught it to you. He knew you were the only one who could be trusted to read it. His words, his simple, profound understanding, settled over her like a warm blanket. He saw her, not as an asset, not as a chaotic civilian, but as the keeper of her uncle's legacy. The space between them, charged for hours with the high-voltage hum of fear and adrenaline, suddenly filled with a different kind of energy. It was quiet, it was deep, and it was potent. She could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, the deep weariness of a man whose world had been upended. But in the depths of his gaze, she also saw an unwavering strength, a protective fire that was burning just for her. The romantic sexual pull she had been fighting, labeling as inappropriate and inconvenient, was no longer a pull. It was an anchor. In the midst of the wreckage of their lives, he was the one solid thing she could hold on to. She stepped closer, closing the small gap between them. "He said to look for the person who makes your heart feel safe," she whispered, the words an echo from a decade ago. Luke's breath hitched. He looked down at her fierce, tear-streaked face illuminated by the faint, ghostly light of the distant city. He had spent his entire career building walls, maintaining professional distance, treating every situation as a tactical problem to be solved. Grace Donovan was not a problem. She was a revelation. She was reckless and brave, and she cared more about a dog's digestion than her own safety, and in that moment, under the silent watch of the decaying giants of industry, he knew he was completely, irrevocably lost. He lifted a hand, his fingers gently brushing the stray auburn curls from her forehead. His touch was hesitant, almost reverent. The agent was gone. This was just Luke. And this was just Grace. The world narrowed to the few inches of charged air that separated their mouths. Barnaby, sensing a lull in the adventure and a profound lack of attention being paid to him, chose that moment to shove his wet nose insistently into Luke's hand. The spell shattered. Luke jolted back as if he'd touched a live wire, a dark flush creeping up his neck. Grace stumbled back a step, her heart hammering. The moment, so fragile and intense, had vanished, leaving a shimmering, awkward silence in its wake. Right, Luke cleared his throat, turning his attention to the dog with an almost comical amount of focus. "Good boy, Barnaby. Excellent security detail." Grace wanted to laugh, or cry, or maybe both. Instead, she turned and led them toward the small steel door, the promise of what had almost happened hanging between them, more powerful than any spoken words. The key slid into the lock with a familiar grating sound. The heavy door swung inward on protesting hinges, opening into a pitch-black space that smelled of dust, old paper, and the faint acidic tang of photographic fixer. Arthur's darkroom. Inside, Grace found a switch, and a single, bare bulb flickered to life, casting a weak yellow glow over the space. It was exactly as he'd left it. An enlarger stood like a sentinel on a long workbench. Trays were stacked neatly. A row of brown chemical bottles lined a shelf. But this was just the antechamber. She led Luke through another door into the main studio space. It was magnificent. A huge, open area with a soaring ceiling and a massive, grime-covered skylight. Old furniture was draped in dusty sheets, like sleeping ghosts. Canvases were stacked against one wall. And in the center of the room, on a heavy wooden table, sat a vintage shortwave radio and an old, disconnected telephone. "What is this place?" Luke breathed, taking in the scene. "His real office," Grace said. This is where he kept the things that mattered. While Luke did a security sweep, checking the door and windows, Grace went to the table. The logbooks they had left behind at her house were not the only ones. A thick, leather-bound journal sat beside the radio. She opened it. The pages were filled with her uncle's familiar scrawl, but it wasn't f-stops and shutter speeds. It was names, dates, shipping numbers, and observations. JM met with Kincaid again today. The rhythm is getting frantic, a heart under duress. The girl from the Port Authority. She knows something is wrong. She asked too many questions about container manifests. They transferred her a week later. I hope she's safe. The opposite of grace isn't ugliness. It's silence. The silence of good people who see something wrong and look away. It was all there. A meticulous, secret record of his descent into Javier Mendoza's world. A world he had entered as an artist and was trying to escape as a witness. Luke came to stand beside her, reading over her shoulder. He knew, Luke said, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and anger. He knew all of it. He was building a case. He was trying to find someone he could trust, Grace corrected softly. And he couldn't find anyone. She flipped to the last page. It was dated the day before he died. The handwriting was shakier than usual, My heart feels like a faulty shutter. I think I'm out of time. I put everything on the drives and gave my Gracie girl the key. She's the only one who speaks the language. If anyone is reading this, get the files to Sarah Chen at the Star. She was my student once. A bulldog. She asks the right questions. She can be trusted. Below the name was a phone number. Sarah Chen. An investigative reporter at the Kansas City Star. A bulldog. It was their answer. Their one shot. The fragile hope that bloomed in the dusty room was extinguished by a sudden, sharp sound from outside. A car door, slamming shut in the alley where they had parked. Luke was instantly in motion, killing the light and pulling Grace away from the table, down behind a stack of old canvases. He crept to a grimy window, wiping a small circle clean with his sleeve, and peered out. 2 cars had pulled into the alley, blocking their sedan. Dark sedans, but they weren't the FBI's black SUVs. These were sleeker, more expensive. Men were getting out, not agents in suits. These were men in tailored coats who moved with the quiet, predatory grace of panthers. Mendoza's men. They found us, Luke whispered, his body shielding hers. Rico's with them. Panic, cold and familiar, seized Grace. They were trapped. The one exit was blocked. But then, she looked around the dark, familiar studio. Her uncle's sanctuary. He always had more than one plan. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for an escape route he would have built. Her gaze fell on the floor, on the heavy oriental rug beneath the main workbench. It was threadbare and bunched up in one corner, as if it had been moved recently. And beneath it she saw the faint outline of a trap door. "Luke," she hissed, pointing. "Plan F. 4th floor." He saw it. A flicker of disbelief, then grudging admiration, crossed his face. As Mendoza's men began to test the steel door to the studio, Luke was already at the rug, pulling it back to reveal a heavy iron ring set into the floorboards. He pulled. The trapdoor lifted, revealing a flight of steep, narrow steps leading down into absolute, suffocating darkness. The air that wafted up smelled of damp earth, river water, and a century of secrets. "Where does it go?" Luke breathed, as the first heavy thud sounded against the studio door. "I have no idea," Grace admitted, grabbing Barnaby's collar. "But it's better than here." The thudding became a splintering crash. The door was giving way. "Go!" Luke commanded, shoving the backpack with the drives into her hands. "Go now!" Grace didn't argue. She scrambled down into the darkness, Barnaby whining as he followed. Luke came last, pulling the heavy trapdoor shut just as the studio door burst open and the room was flooded with the beams of powerful flashlights. The last thing Grace saw before the trapdoor sealed them in darkness was the splintered wood of the studio door and the promise of a fight that was very far from over. Chapter 10. The Opposite of Silence. The darkness was absolute, a physical weight that pressed in on them, stealing breath and direction. It smelled of a century of damp earth, of secrets left to molder, and the faint, metallic scent of the river. Above them, the heavy thuds and splintered crashes of Mendoza's men ransacking the studio were muffled, terrifyingly remote sounds, like the footsteps of angry gods on the roof of the world. Grace clutched Barnaby's collar, her other hand gripping the backpack containing her uncle's life's work. The dog, a creature of pure instinct, was trembling, his warm body a solid, living anchor in the disorienting blackness. Beside her, Luke was a presence of coiled energy, his breathing controlled and even, a stark contrast to the frantic hammering of her own heart. He pulled the heavy trapdoor fully shut, the final thud sealing them into the unknown. For a long moment they stood frozen, listening. The sounds from above faded as the search party presumably moved on. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow more menacing. "Okay," Luke's voice was a low rumble, startlingly close in the dark. "New plan. We live." "I like it," Grace whispered back, her voice shaky. "Simple. To the point." He produced a small tactical flashlight from his pocket, the sudden sharp beam cutting a cone of light through the oppressive gloom. It revealed a narrow, brick-lined tunnel, just tall enough for them to stand upright. The floor was packed earth, slick with moisture, and the walls wept beads of condensation. It stretched forward into an identical darkness. "Bootlegger's tunnel?" Grace guessed, her voice echoing slightly. "Or a storm drain." "Or the front door to hell," Luke replied, his tone grim. He swept the beam behind them. The tunnel continued in that direction too. No going back. We go forward. He took the lead, his weapon held at a low ready, the flashlight beam dancing ahead of them. Grace followed, her hand on his back, a small point of contact that felt as vital as air. Barnaby, leash held tight, trotted between them, his initial fear already giving way to the sheer, unadulterated joy of a new and excitingly smelly place to explore. They walked for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds the soft squelch of their shoes, Barnaby's happy panting, and the drip, drip, drip of water from the vaulted ceiling. The tunnel was a time machine, carrying them further and further away from the life Grace had known. "My entire career is gone," Luke said suddenly, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Everything I built, my reputation, my clearance, gone. Kincaid will have painted me as a traitor who kidnapped a civilian. There's no coming back from that, not without irrefutable proof." Grace's hand tightened on his back. "We have the proof," she insisted. "It's in this bag. We just have to get it to the right person." "The right person?" he scoffed, the sound bitter. "Everyone I would have called, the right person, reported to Kincaid. I'm an island, Grace. We're an island." "Then it's a good thing my uncle left us a boat," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she didn't entirely feel. "Sarah Chen. The reporter. He trusted her." Luke was silent for several more paces. The flashlight beam caught the slick movement of a fat river rat scurrying into a fissure in the brickwork. "A reporter. That's our Hail Mary. A civilian journalist against a shadow conspiracy inside the FBI and the most powerful cartel in the Midwest." He stopped and turned, the flashlight beam illuminating her face. He looked utterly exhausted, the sharp lines of his face carved from weariness. "It's insane." "So is using a dog biscuit to outsmart a hitman," she pointed out. "We're kind of specializing in insane right now." A reluctant, weary smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, chasing away some of the darkness. "You are a walking, talking, operational security nightmare, Grace Donovan." "And you," she retorted, her voice softening, "are the only reason I'm alive to be a nightmare." He said to look for the person who makes your heart feel safe. "It's funny. I've never felt less safe in my entire life," but she trailed off, the rest of the sentence hanging, unspoken but deafening, in the close, damp air. He held her gaze, the flashlight casting a golden glow on her face, turning her unruly auburn hair into a halo of fire. The almost kiss in the rail yard, the memory of his hand on her face, rushed back with dizzying intensity. The world, with its cartels and corrupt agents, fell away, and there was only the two of them in the belly of the earth, their survival and their future inextricably tangled. He took a half-step closer, and for a heart-stopping second, she thought he would finish what Barnaby had interrupted. But the moment was broken by a change in the air. A faint, cool breeze touched their faces, carrying with it the smell of river water and night-blooming jasmine. "There," Luke said, his voice husky. He turned and pushed forward, the spell broken. "There's an end to this thing." The tunnel opened onto a rusted, iron grate. Luke put his shoulder to it, and with a groan of protesting metal, it swung open. They emerged, blinking into the cool night air, finding themselves on a small stone landing directly beneath the massive arches of the ASB bridge. The river flowed just feet below them, a wide, dark highway under the stars. Across the water, the downtown skyline glittered, a remote and inaccessible kingdom of light. They were free of the tunnel, but they were still trapped. Far away, in his own kingdom of light, Javier Mendoza stared at a grainy black-and-white photograph on his screen. It was an old newspaper clipping, a feature on promising young journalism students from a decade ago. A bright-eyed young woman named Sarah Chen smiled out from the page, standing next to her proud mentor, Arthur Donovan. "He taught her," Javier murmured to the empty room. "He taught her his language." The bulldog, he picked up his phone. "Rico. Forget the agent. Forget the safe house. The girl, Grace Donovan, she's going to try and finish her uncle's last story. Find me the reporter." At the same time, in a sterile federal office that felt more like a tomb, Robert Kincaid slammed his fist on his desk. The hunt was a bust. Rhodes and the girl had vanished from the building as if they'd been ghosts. His mole, Mendoza, had gone silent. Kincaid was flying blind, and the evidence that could destroy him was blowing in the wind with a rogue agent he had tragically, fatally underestimated. He had set a trap, and now he was the one who felt the jaws closing. An hour later, Grace and Luke were huddled in the relative anonymity of the city market, the early morning vendors setting up their stalls around them. The air smelled of fresh bread, diesel fumes, and dew-damp produce. Luke, using a burner phone he'd had stashed in his backpack, made the call. Sarah Chen, a sharp, no-nonsense voice answered. "My name is Luke Rhodes. "I'm calling about Arthur Donovan," he said, his voice low. There was a pause. "Arthur's dead," she said, her voice wary. "I know. But he left something behind. A final story. He said you were the only one who could be trusted to write it." Another silence, longer this time. Grace held her breath, watching a man stack pyramids of bright red apples. "Where?" Sarah Chen finally asked. "Union Station," Luke said, naming the grandest, most public place in the city. "The Grand Hall. By the clock. Noon. Come alone." "You'll be walking into the biggest fishbowl in Kansas City," she warned. "You know that, right? It's the only place big enough to hide," he said, and hung up. The hours leading up to noon were the longest of Grace's life. They bought coffee and stale pastries from a vendor, sharing them on a bench, while Barnaby made friends with every person who walked by. They looked like any other couple enjoying a morning in the city, but the tension between them was a third entity, a live wire crackling in the space they shared. They were about to walk into the heart of the fire, and they had no idea if they would walk out. At 11:45, they entered Union Station. The Grand Hall was breathtaking, its 95-foot ceiling arching over a floor bustling with tourists, travelers, and locals. Sunlight streamed through the huge, cathedral-like windows. It was beautiful, awe-inspiring, and a tactical nightmare. "Stay with the dog by the entrance to the planetarium," Luke instructed, his eyes scanning every balcony, every doorway. "If things go south, you don't wait. You run. Get out, call the number in the journal from a payphone, and tell her to check her email. I'm sending her a single, encrypted file right now. It's not everything, but it's enough to get the ball rolling. It's our insurance policy." He looked at her, and the carefully constructed walls of the federal agent crumbled completely, leaving just a man, his expression raw with a fear that was entirely for her. He reached out and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. "Grace," he started, his voice thick with all the things they hadn't had time to say. "Don't," she whispered, her heart aching. "Don't say goodbye." She leaned in and pressed her lips to his, a kiss that was desperate and fierce and full of a terrifying, beautiful promise. It was a kiss that acknowledged everything, the danger, the fear, the impossible, undeniable connection that had forged between them in the crucible of the last 24 hours. When she pulled back, his eyes were shining. "Okay," he breathed. "No goodbye." He turned and walked toward the massive clock in the center of the hall. Grace watched him go, her hand clutching Barnaby's leash, her heart a painful knot in her chest. A woman with a sharp haircut and intelligent, assessing eyes approached him. Sarah Chen. They spoke for a moment, and Luke slid the backpack off his shoulder. And then, everything happened at once. From one side of the hall, Rico and two of Mendoza's men appeared, moving with silent, deadly purpose. From the other side, near the main entrance, Special Agent Robert Kincaid emerged, flanked by two grim-faced agents. They had all converged on the same point, two predators arriving to claim the same kill, their eyes locked on Luke. Grace saw it unfold in slow motion. Luke, seeing both groups, pushed Sarah Chen behind a marble column, shoving the backpack into her hands. "Run!" Kincaid saw Mendoza's men. Rico saw the feds. For a split second, the two villains stared at each other across the polished floor, their private, profitable alliance dissolving in the bright, public sunlight. Betrayal, cold and sharp, flashed in Kincaid's eyes. He raised his weapon, not at Luke, but at Rico. "He's with Mendoza!" Kincaid shouted to his men, his voice booming in the cavernous hall. "They're all Cartel! Take them!" It was a desperate, brilliant move to save himself, to rewrite the narrative with bullets. But Javier Mendoza had also made a call. As the first shot was fired, not by an agent, but by a KCPD officer stationed on the balcony, the hall erupted not in chaos, but in controlled, overwhelming force. Uniformed police officers swarmed in from every entrance. Sarah Chen, the bulldog, had not come alone. She had brought the cavalry. In the confusion, Grace acted. She didn't run. She went toward him. She let go of Barnaby's leash. "Go get him, boy," she yelled, pointing at a man, Rico, who was taking aim at a distracted Luke. Barnaby, propelled by the two most exciting words in his vocabulary, launched himself forward, a 70-pound missile of pure, goofy enthusiasm. He hit Rico at knee level. The hitman went down with a surprised yelp, his shot going wide and shattering a glass case in the gift shop. The distraction was all Luke needed. He tackled Kincaid, sending them both crashing to the marble floor, Kincaid's gun skittering away. The fight was over in seconds. The hall was filled with the shouts of police, the clicking of handcuffs, and the triumphant, happy barking of a golden retriever who was now being lavished with praise by a dozen uniformed officers. It was over. 3 weeks later, the late afternoon sun streamed into Grace's bungalow, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house smelled of lavender, cinnamon, and the peanut butter apple dog biscuits she was pulling from the oven. It was quiet, it was safe, it was home. The story had exploded. Sarah Chen's exposé, built on the mountain of evidence from Arthur Donovan's hard drives, had dismantled a dynasty. Javier Mendoza had been arrested trying to flee the country. Robert Kincaid, facing a mountain of corruption charges, had taken his own life in his cell. The ghosts had been exorcised. The doorbell rang. Grace opened it to find Luke Rhodes on her porch. He was wearing jeans and a simple gray t-shirt, not a suit. He looked younger, more relaxed, the easygoing man from the surveillance photo, finally emerging from behind the hardened agent. In his hands he held a small, ridiculously over-engineered stack of interlocking plastic crates. "Workplace safety hazard," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I figured you could use a better system," she laughed. A real, unburdened sound. "Come in, Agent Rhodes." "It's just Luke now," he said, stepping inside. "I'm on indefinite leave. Apparently, dating a key witness in a major federal investigation is frowned upon. Are you?" she asked, her heart giving a hopeful little leap. Dating the witness? He set the crates down and closed the distance between them. The air was still, the house was quiet, and the frantic energy of their adventure had been replaced by a deep, settled warmth. The pole was still there, no longer dangerous and electric, but a steady, magnetic force. "I was thinking about it," he said, his blue eyes soft and serious. "But I was told I should look for someone who makes my heart feel safe. And with you, my heart rate has rarely dropped below 120. I have that effect on people," she said, her voice a little breathless. "But," he continued, gently taking her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles, "my uncle, a different uncle, a boring one who sold insurance. He always said the most important things in life are the ones that are worth the risk." He looked at her then, a world of feeling passing between them, in a silent, shared gaze. "And you, Grace Donovan, are the most magnificent risk I've ever taken." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of Union Station. It was a kiss of arrival. It was slow and deep, and full of the promise of quiet mornings, walks with the dog, and a lifetime of beautiful, chaotic, grace-filled adventure. When they finally broke apart, Barnaby trotted over and shoved his head between them, demanding his share of the attention. Luke laughed, scratching the dog behind the ears. "See? A constant state of emergency." "You'll get used to it," Grace said, looping her arms around his neck, feeling, for the first time in a long time, perfectly, wonderfully, and completely safe. Welcome to the opposite of silence.